Good morning. My name is John Davis. Shelterbelts have been part of my life 24 hours a day for the last 3 or 4 years, and previously about 25 years before that. And it will continue to be so. It's not interesting. And I start with a very simple idea that wind equals wind chill equals wind speed. So the faster the wind, the colder it is. The opposite is also true. So the slower the wind, the warmer it becomes. And the wind being plates of different speeds of wind running at different temperatures. By using the tree and leaf architecture, we can create microclimate, which is a bubble of warm wind holding up because warm air rises, colder, faster wind going over the top. This is a very simple, well-known and well-researched, obvious truth. And it needs repeated because the microclimates created, if done within 2 very simple rules, are amazing. And you can be a howling gale on one side and in your shirt sleeves on the other. This is commonplace and everybody knows. But the rules are actually very important. And there are 2 very simple rules, which are that the trees and the leaf architecture should have 50% porosity. In other words, 50% hold, because that is what slows the wind and warms the wind to create the microclimate. So we'll go back to 50%. But the second rule is that it is the extent of the microclimate, which is equivalent for polytunnel, is 20 times the height of the tallest trees. Therefore, a tree 10 meters high will have a microclimate of 200 meters, which is a very considerable amount of ground on which the benefits of microclimate happen. So these benefits we are going to talk about, but staying on this 50% porosity, what is actually 50% porosity? And you can look at a bunch of trees and say, well, look, that looks okay. And you can look at others and say, well, that's not going to work. What is absolutely clear, and we're talking engineering rather than plant science, is that this is absolutely right. It's black and white, right and wrong, proven in wind tunnels, and that work I was involved with 25 years ago in Oxford University, when I received an enormous grant in excess of £100,000, which we spent on the schools of engineering and the schools of plant science of Oxford University to determine the aerodynamic characteristics of microclimate. And we did work in wind tunnels, and it was very interesting bringing the 2 scientific disciplines of engineering, black and white, right and wrong. The aeroplane mustn't fall out of the sky, the bridge mustn't fall down. And plant science, which is much more gradually moving a bit of this and a bit of that. So it was a very interesting thing. And we really only put fine tunes when we developed certain characteristics of measurements of S that you could determine this extent of the microclimate. I want to say that if you don't have this 50% microclimate, and you, for instance, have a thick wall, it actually becomes worse, and you get turbulence that comes the other side. So you do need to get this right, and that needs some continual thing. And there's been a gap in science so that we haven't been able to determine it, and we think we can very easily by using a thing called digital imaging analysis, and using drones you can quickly photograph and determine where and so you can get to your optimum microclimate, which will be important to know, because we don't really know whether 40% is 60% or what is it. We do know what's bad, and actually many hedges are very bad, and so you think a hedge automatically creates microclimate, but if it's creating turbulence and it's too dense, you're really not doing very much. So we finished this work in 1999, and then we didn't sell a single one. And the reason was that the rules of the Common Agricultural Policy changed, if you remember, from quotas into a rules-based system. And we fell outside the rules. In fact, one of my farmers was fined £10,000 for allowing his hedges to grow out to 5 metres wide. So post-Brexit, this all changed. And I read again our work, which was, and I said, this is rather a good bit of work. And I showed it to one of lady on the Cotswolds, Jenny Phelps Fruag, who runs the top 50 farmers, and she said, well, why don't you ask your farmers what they think about it? And so I agreed to visit 20 of her top 50 farmers that she selected, of which Becky is one, and but I stopped at visit 13 because everybody wanted one, and I'd sold 20 miles of Shelterbelts of this new, I have to say, not novel design, it's like reinventing the wheel, and the great work has been done. This is the standard Forestry Commission bulletin by cable number 17, 1957. Absolutely brilliant. Everybody loves it. But, and I say, well, it didn't start because it blamed the Common Agricultural Policy, but it wasn't actually that. It was that the fossil fuel industry won. It was cheaper to throw a bag of fertilizer on a field and use insecticide than let nature do the work for you. And in proof of this, the professor who was supervising our town science side made a talk at the first World Windbreak Technology Conference in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1987. And these proceedings, 600 pages of brilliant stuff, still available. But there was never another one. And I think this was the reason was that the fossil fuel industry had won. But now this has changed. So I think it's now, and we have since Jenny Phelps started us all 4 years ago, created trial Shelterbelts using similar planting, similar trials on 23 different sites with 13 farmers on the Cotswolds, and we are now proving these well-known engineering facts and finding what effects it has on crops, on livestock, on biodiversity. And I want to talk about the establishment, costs of aftercare, and Jim will help us with the currently not terribly helpful available ability stance, but Helen said we're working on it. we can do things now and make things happen for you. So if I could pass over to Zeki to tell you why she's interested in Shelterbelts.
Yes, so I farm on the Oxfordshire-Wiltshire borders, and I farm about 365 hectares, mixed farm. When I first met John, we were dairy, and we're now beef and arable. My main holding farm is National Trust, and I have always been passionate about sort of trying to do things holistically, I guess, in a conventional setting. It's a way that I'd sort of describe it. With the cattle, I'd always observed how where we set up our grazing platform, it was essential that we had good hedgerows, whether it's for browse or for shelter. But there was lots of advantages to having that. But what I noted is around the farm we actually had a central belt, which was what we call a double hedge, which essentially was put in probably sort of 100 years ago, and it was to support part of the estate, which was for shooting and for conservation reasons. But that particular area, we had really good productivity, I guess, on both sides of that. The other thing that I'd noted is that we've got a couple of fields that are on the grazing platform that were established at identical times and identical seeding, so they were an Italian ryegrass mix that were for cutting and grazing. However, one side had really decent hedges all the way around, and the other side was more exposed. They're the same sort of height, they're the same soil type, everything was exactly the same, and I can never understand how one side was infinitely more productive than the other side. When Jenny introduced me to John and we started talking about Shelterbelt projects, I immediately thought of this area of the farm as a perfect place to go and walk with John. And as we walked up, John started to explain all the scientific research that he'd done on sort of the wind and creating this microclimate, and it made perfect sense to me that up in these fields we'd got one that was far more exposed, even though there were hedges there, John, aren't there, on two sides of them, but where the wind direction was coming was a little bit more open, and there was sort of an old hedge, but it was poorly managed. The cattle had grazed it, the sheep had been through it, and so it was quite open. So that's where we started with one of the Shelterbelts, and that was really my sort of interest in it. So it's been a really fascinating project to be involved with, and we've done 2 more since, haven't we? And looking at the planting, for me it's an opportunity to get more trees onto the farm, but without taking land out of production as well. So it's really sort of trying to create that balance.
Jen, would you like to
Thank you. Thanks, Becky and John. I'm Jim O'Neill, Forestry Commissioner. I'm the Agroforestry Development Manager. My background has been most of my career as a woodland officer, creating woodlands and managing woodlands across farmland and estates in Cumbria. Latterly, I've got this role as the Agroforestry Development Manager, which is great. And I like to think that whilst whatever grants we may have, that agroforestry is a spectrum across the board, from trees in hedges right through to small woodlands on a farm, and everything goes in between. The issue we have at the moment, as John implied, is that the grant that's being developed for agroforestry is for in-field agroforestry, but that's not to say that we're not forgetting all the other types, and we will be coming to them in due course. In the past and currently, we have supported Shelterbelts, 20 metre wide Shelterbelts, and now we're able to go down to 10 metre wide Shelterbelts. But John's design has come up with a much narrower design, which I think is really important. John mentioned the porosity of Shelterbelts and how important that is. That book you showed, John, it is the sort of Bible for Shelterbelts. There has been so much science on Shelterbelts and the effects of Shelterbelts over many decades. It's really convincing science, and I think we've done a really poor job of communicating that. With people like Becky who can share their experiences of what shelter does for their farms, I think that's the important thing. We can get the science, but we've got to get the message across, and that's where we've done a really bad job, I think. I think the scientists sat back and say, there you go, great, we've proved it, but we've got to get it in practice. So some of John's designs are a really excellent way of, to hold this, a really excellent way to improve shelter and add shelter to farms without losing too much land, which I think is really important. Something also I think we need to think about is management of those shelter belts, because as John mentioned, keeping that porosity, allowing the wind through the shelter belt is really important. And we don't want to just plant and forget. We want to plant and monitor and manage that shelter belt accordingly to the benefit of the farm and also the shelter belt. You know, my view, I can't help the forester in me, you know, if we're growing trees, why don't we try and grow some decent trees as well? You know, it's not appropriate everywhere, but where it is, you know, why not try and get some quality? And in doing that, you could be pruning trees and improving the quality and increasing or maintaining that porosity balance.
Thank you very much, Jim. That's brilliant. Our design is not rocket science and it's not new. It was proposed through the Oxford Forestry Institute, who spent with the Commonwealth Forester. They were imperial foresters in many years, and basically it's what we developed as a suggestion, an initial suggestion. Not the only one, is we're using 18 different species on 4 rows of trees, taking a maximum of 5 meters. 6 of the trees are tall trees, which grow as fast as possible, like aspen and poplar and alder and hornbeams. 6 are intermediate trees with porosity, like birch and rowan. Don't forget goat willow. When a cow feels off colour and needs an aspirin, it goes and takes a bite of goat willow. And then shrubs, the underlayer, where we're doing things. It's not rocket science, but it's in the right direction, and we've got 2 alternatives which fit the grant system. Around that, I want to really work and open it up to the audience to talk in terms of crops, in terms of livestock, biodiversity, the establishment costs, etc. If we take crops first, the first argument I have is, when the first row of combine goes round the field, it's always a low yield. And that's undoubtedly absolutely true. And one of my farmers pointed out, well, yes, but all birds, predators and things, land near the hedgerow and eat their way in from there. So that's one good reason. The other is turbulence, but also it's a very short area. It's a small turbulent area, and we would say that the increase in crop arising from greater humidities and things will more than that, and we will have to establish that over the time. So if we can break it down into questions for the audience on crops and us, and we'll do our best to answer that.
Any questions? I say between the group, but I think it might be it. Any questions?
I think your last point was extremely important. We have the same effect in agroforestry, where farmers see a diminishing effect in the yield close to the trees. And in the old days, that was enough to put them off for good. But do you think with now the improved mechanised harvesting, where you've got constant yield monitoring, they'll now be able to see the compensation where the bulk of the field is actually over yielding? That would not have been apparent without this new technology. You can see it in real time as you harvest from the conduit.
I think Sorry, I think that's exactly right, yes. And we will have to prove that over the period.
In addition to that, there's this understanding the science behind the porosity of the hedges and the trees is really fascinating, because John made the point earlier about not having that density there to create turbulence, and I think we sort of have in the past, certainly on farm, just looked at sort of hedgerows and tree management as sort of an aside and not really as an integral part of our management system. And for me, that's why it's been really interesting being able to work with the likes of John and having, discussion groups where we've had people like Jim out on farm as well to sort of help explain how to manage that effectively to get the best out of it. And it's really imperative that when we come to talking about costs and establishment, when we talk about the maintenance of these shelter belts, because it is another skill set, isn't it, Jim? And it's something that can have a huge difference when we're talking about, keeping that crop yield and keeping the grassland in good nick for livestock management. It is all about the whole management system, and it's not just about what's inside the field.
Yeah.
Thanks, Becky. Just to finish off on that, one of the reasons why in the agroforestry grants that we're developing, we've included pruning as part of the requirement, because we want everyone out there to have as best an experience of agroforestry as possible, and we feel that by pruning you're potentially improving timber quality, but more to the point, you're allowing more light to the ground, to the crops or the livestock, more side light. And reducing that negative effect of the crop where it comes near to the trees. Stephen Briggs, our sort of rock star agroforester, he has rows of apple trees in the cereal fields on the fens, and he in fact has greater growth of cereal yield nearest to the apple trees, and he's yielding. He's taken about 10% of the land out to put the apple tree rows in, but he's still yielding 100% of the previous yield from 90% of the land. And that's partly because of the protection and the lack of wind threshing. So it's getting really painful. And partly because of the mycorrhizal sort of soil improvements, if you like, nearer to the trees. So there is a balance somewhere, and if we can apply the same sort of management techniques and science to managing our shelter belts, then hopefully we'll see very similar effects.
That's another point, isn't it?
That was another point you were going to talk about, wasn't it?
I think the point that Becky and Jim are making is that the importance of soil temperature. That if the microclimate increases the soil temperature, and I think on Becky's farm, which is very heavy clay, cold soils, that is emphasised that if we can raise the soil temperature, it makes an enormous difference in grassland recovery and in crop growth. You were talking about 6 weeks more time on one field to another between the grassland recovery. Well, that's serious big money, and I think that we are holding back the idea that money is the important piece. We are looking for improvements in profitability, improvements in yield, measuring these, and really finding where the limits are, because there are limits, and it's not just one rule for all, which the engineers like to tell us, but it's there. So I think we'll do that. Shall we move on to livestock now? Well, sorry.
Well, firstly, well done with everything you're doing. I think you're absolutely right. Probably Jim said it best, that a lot of this information, we already have more information than we need to prove the case. The issue is distilling it into a punchy, simple, adoptable message for people to get their head around and get on with. So well done with your work. But my question is just, we're a 1,000-acre estate in South Yorkshire. We do a hell of a lot of hedge laying, and that's our geek topic. And I'm now as we've looked at porosity of shelterbelts, we've just done 10 acres of new shelterbelts for livestock future shade. We're more thinking about shade than the wind effect, but although both will benefit. My question really is, sometimes are we focusing with hedgerow management for the benefit of maximum density and like nesting bird habitat? Are we making those landscape features too imporous, too much of a windbreak, in terms of turbulence on the side? Is there a risk that one of our aims is detrimental to the other?
Yeah, I'm going to hand back to Jim for this, but before we do, I'm just going to say that I have had this conversation with my landlord, and we're looking at doing a sort of longer term programme of hedgerow management rather than doing to ensure that we can open out that sort of porosity that John's talking about by having a variation around the farm rather than sort of doing it all in one go, if you like, and coming back every 3 years.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're quite right. Where we've got anything really dense and solid creates turbulence behind it generally. So I guess, if your hedges aren't too high, then it's very limited. But if you're going for a 3 metre high hedge, then the effect's going to be similar. I wonder, by adding a tree element to that hedge with a pruned stem, so you've got a gap to the canopy of the tree. I wonder if that might help.
I think you're really talking about having 3 layers: the shrub layer, an intermediate layer, and the tall tree layer. This is very much developed in what's called the Miyawaki system, which is quite an urban planting system. Brilliant, but highly expensive. But keep these 3 layers, and we can measure the porosity in the different slopes. I think the bottom layer, we can allow that to be as dense, fairly dense, but not totally dense. But you're absolutely right. A very good point to bring out.
I think that as well, if you think about the farm on a landscape scale, if every field has effective hedges and windbreaks, you're increasing that sort of drag effect, and you're slowing that wind speed down across the whole farm rather than just on a field to field basis. And I think that will have an overall effect.
Thank you. Should we move on to livestock?
Yeah.
Sorry, one more question there.
So it's just a feedback on that last point about the terminology. So the terminology's moved on a lot since the Shelterbelt terminology. So my company's involved with nature-based solutions globally in China and Bangladesh and places. So we have the idea of a shelter belt, and then thanks to New Zealand and Australia, we have the idea of a timber belt, where a key financial consideration is that it's a shelter belt primarily for the microclimate, but timber is going to be a valuable output. And then what we've developed in Portugal on large-scale blueberry agroforestry is what we call a biodiversity belt. So that follows the idea that to grow this blueberry agroforestry, we need good control of the winds and damaging factors. And these are going to be incredibly financially important trees with a biodiversity value. So a lot of the oaks and the stone pines, they have a great biodiversity value. So I think we need to develop the terminology so people can instantly recognise the different subsystems and the way they move forward.
Well done, excellent point. Right, on livestock, we come to the important principle of the thermal neutral zone, a comfort zone of livestock, in which they are growing optimally, using the optimal amount of food and energy to be. And once the livestock get wet and cold, they go very quickly down below that thermal zone. And our work with organic research centres is emphasised and brought out the enormous extra amount of food. It's like 25% more food is required to keep an animal within the thermal comfort zone once he's outside, and that is what our microclimates will provide, that area where you have greater warmth, greater soil temperature, greater soil humidity, and I think that's the principle that we are trying to put numbers to, defining thermal comfort zones and the amounts of food there. And I think, Becky, will be, if we survive long enough, we'll have quite a good answer to that in about 10 years' time.
I think so, yeah. Well, so on farm, I do quite a lot of monitoring of the livestock. We weigh monthly, and I do AMP system grazing. For anyone that knows that, that's adaptive multi-paddock grazing, so that we move the cattle around depending on what's happening given any given season. No 2 years are the same. So, for example, this year I've actually took a group off the main platform to give them a longer time because of this weather that we've had that's drying everything out. But one thing we've noted is as soon as they come back, when it's hot like it has been, having the shelter belt, for them to go and stand underneath has been absolutely key.
Yeah, this is important to keep the cattle cool in the warmth. I've heard several people saying the main reason they want the shelter belt is to keep the cattle cool, not to keep them warm. So I think that's a very important point, and I think this is an area where, in a way, I think we're going to show more benefits, or it'll be easier to explain to the livestock farmer, and I think it was to you than to some of my animal farmers. I think this is work that we can produce, and that now gets to popularise fairly quickly. So, shall we move on? Any more questions on livestock? Sorry.
Oh yeah, and so if the thermal neutral zone keeps cattle and sheep warmer in winter so they need less feed, does it also equate that if they get cooler they need less water in the summer to keep cool? So are you doing an overall carbon calculation on livestock to see the impact if you put a shelter belt on?
We haven't, but having said that, we've got enough data where I've done some carbon baselining, and we've got lots of soil tests that we are continually doing. So I'm hoping that some of that data might show a correlation. The trouble is that the shelter belts are quite young, so it takes quite a long time to establish. So the trees we planted 2 years ago, they're not huge at the moment, are they, John?
No.
And so, it's work in progress. That data won't be available immediately, and there haven't been any particularly significant studies on it because we haven't had the science there to be able to analyse it in the past. But hopefully that'll come.
I'm just wondering, so if you have, say, an acre field, would you just surround the perimeter with the shelter belt, or would you do multiple shelter belts within the same field?
So John was quite specific when you came out to my farm. We walked and we were talking about the predominant wind direction that was coming in, and so we started off on that particular border to look at the sort of the worst culprit, if you like. I mean, obviously wind directions change, but each farm will have a predominant area that it comes into, won't it, John?
Yeah, I have bisected quite a number of fields on some schemes recently, and I think the theory would be the bisect should be the maximum 20 times height of the tallest trees, or if you like, your optimal knob grazing amount of fields. But I'm doing on Andrew Wolf, for example, quite a complicated. We were thrown out the first time and went out because it was rich in fire, and so national wave threw us out. But we found some other fields we're doing it on. Do you remember you went there during June? And do you remember Andrew Wolf?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the importance of tailoring to your particular circumstances, which I think you alluded to anyway. We're talking very specifically about Shelterbelts here, but the Shelterbelts, as I said, is just one of the spectrum of agroforestry that we're looking at. And I would be looking at your whole farm, and we have a thing called PA4 agroforestry plan, which zooms out, looks at your whole farm, looks at your business, looks at what your requirements might be, and then you start to plan. I think that's a really important part of any process, good planning and execution of what you need for your particular circumstances. And I think upgrading, sort of parcels and that sort of thing are all drivers for increasing or putting back in field boundaries, and why not make them useful, rather than just a fence,
I think the field boundary is a very good start. They weren't stupid, our forebears, when they divided their fields up. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah, just coming back, the whole farm approach that the Forestry Commission have looked at has been really useful. And do you want to just give everybody a bit of an insight, because that is quite an underrated tool as well, the PA?
Yeah, well, firstly, the tent behind us, we have a bunch of agroforestry woodland officers who will be able to help you sort of look at your farm and any proposals, and perhaps come out and visit. It took a little bit of convincing for DEFRA, because they were interested in the field that you're going to do your agroforestry in, and we convinced them that we need to think about the context of that field within the wider landscape and the wider farm business. We've been successful in getting them there, and they're now on board, which is great. It's a really good resource. It's a funded plan to come and look at your land. And whilst we have the offer for infield agroforestry, it certainly considers everything from hedges right through to woodland in the same plan. So you'll have a zoomed out sort of overarching look at the farm. So I would urge everyone to make as much use of that as possible. You don't have to do anything after it. If you feel that it's not for you, that's fine. That's a perfectly good outcome. But I think it's more and more in this day and age, we need to consider all the options available to us, and that's one way of starting the process and directing you to where you might want to go. Absolutely.
Just building on the question by this gentleman here, which, when you're talking about an optimal Shelterbelt design, presumably if you put those too frequently across a farm, does that have a detrimental effect on the landscape scale wind speed of it going down and bouncing back up? And can you put them too frequently, or does it just make a microclimate benefit across the whole thing? Is there like an optimum spacing?
I think for the optimum spacing length is as you wish, but with a minimum of probably 200 to 300 meters, somewhere between there. I wouldn't think that we were talking about an overall detrimental effect. I think that would be quite extreme and hard to prove. I'm not quite sure whether you could say it would be an improvement, but I'm not quite sure what we're looking for actually, but I think the 20 times rule is a good rule.
I think the more sort of roughness that the landscape has in it, the more likely it is to slow down overall wind speed. So, but I'm not sure if there's been any science as to how close Shelterbelts might be and what the negative effects might be. But the negative effects I would be thinking of are light. If they're too close, you'll perhaps start to rob light from some of the parcels and that sort of thing. So it's a balancing effect really, and also how much money has everyone got to start putting in new Shelterbelts every 20 meters or something. You just might not want to go there, but tailoring to your farm would be what I would suggest. And if you've got 1,000 hectares, did you say? 1,000 acres, still plenty big enough. Have a look at that at the whole and see where the prevailing winds are and the problem winds. Very often the problem winds are the other ones, aren't they? So they're coming from a different direction, and sort of plan accordingly.
Well, one thing just add to that, on width, length of Shelterbelts, which mostly are field lengths, and I suppose we average about 300 metres. There's one third small rule is don't have it less than 100 metres, otherwise you'll get eddying round the edges. You can have it, but it won't be, you won't get the optimum efficiency. But that's just a minor point. Shall we move on to the biodiversity angle, where I think we're here talking about the optimum width, where we have gone for 5 metres, which is below the Forestry Commission recommendation of 20 metres for a sheltered wood, though they will come down with persuasion for 10 metres into a smaller format. But 5 metres was, from an engineering and plant science point of view, was almost the maximum really you needed, maybe the optimum. It also was quite an easy amount to persuade the farmer that 5 metres in it could be even including a hedge, which we have on one of your arable fields, is not a lot of land to lose. And this is quite a serious matter, even though we're hopefully creating future yields. But also there's no question that a 5 metre hedge has a considerably more biodiversity in it than a 1.5 metre hedge. And we are going to try and put numbers to this in terms of insects, birds, and all that. And it'd be quite easy and interesting to measure, because you've got a bit of optimum Shelterbelt, and then adjacent to it will be some less than optimum, so we'll be able to measure quite easily. I think, we're also very much looking at the carbon soil analysis, and we've already taken carbon soil analysis baseline data, so that we can see how that improves over the years, over 5 metres, plus the microclimate, plus the increased soil temperatures. So I think we bring the mycorrhizas and that in. And there was, on the previous seminar here, we had a super Cornish farmer who said it's quite important to subsoil along the edge to stop the roots extending too much out into the field, and that has no detriment at all on the growth of the trees.
We were going to talk about the natural regeneration within the Shelterbelts as well, weren't we? Because on my farm in particular, we've had quite a lot of blackthorn come in between, which is great. But talking about that, you referenced a book by Susie Simmond, which I found fascinating to share with everybody.
Yes, this is quite a recent book of a Canadian blogger who was very keen on natural regeneration from trees, and she found that when mother trees drop their seeds, they create small seedlings which are very prone to drought because they've got very small root structures. But very quickly there's a mycorrhizal goes back to the pillar of water in the trees that are in the root structure of another tree, and they feed them with nutrients and things that cause it. It's a fascinating issue, but the mothers only feed their own children, they don't feed other people's children. No questions on the biodiversity. Any questions on the biodiversity? Yes, but I think this is a really important one. Obviously, I think it's important we put numbers and we carry on research on that. If we move on to the establishment costs and the aftercare, this is, I think, the main difference that we've come to is that we are recommending using a biodegradable matting on these 5 metre or indeed 2 metre strips. The reasons for this are twofold. One, when we're planting up against hedges, they are phenomenal weed banks of brambles, docks, nettles and thistles. And so anything we can do to keep them is incredibly important. The second one is my farmers are all absolutely lovely people, but I were 6 of 13 who, many of them are organic, some are organic and won't use glyphosate, naturally, but even using glyphosate at the right time on modern farming conditions when you've barely got time to get off your tractor is incredibly difficult. And
yeah, that was something that I fell foul of, wasn't it, the first year? Because I, in my great wisdom, thought, well, I'm not going to glyphosate round trees because that doesn't sort of sit well with me, and I will just go round and strim. Well, of course, that it's A, laborious and time-consuming, and also a flipping nightmare because some of the time I wasn't very careful, and yeah, there were 1 or 2 sort of casualties, weren't there? So.
Yeah, I think I wasn't. You were in my number 2 category.
It was all experiment, John.
All experiment, but they obviously using this principle, which I don't know anyone would disagree with, it adds very considerably the cost. The biodegradable one that we are using is probably called Ecotex from a firm called Hightex, the landscape contractor. And we may be using this year a woolen one, and instantly deer seem to dislike wool, and that seems to help. So there are these 2 possibilities.
It's not mulch and said.
Yeah, our experience with mulch is this is wonderful. We've used it and I've put 200 tons by hand along a hedge once, and it didn't work at all. Everything came through.
I guess
and I put it different widths. I went up to 10 inches. So, but if you can put mulch on top of the biodegradable matting, that's wonderful. So that is really urban landscaping, and that's the best practice. I couldn't possibly agree more. What would you say?
I was just more of a general comment. You know, we go to all this trouble of planting the trees and putting the trees in whatever protection we put them in. If we don't look after them, we've just wasted all that money, and it's really important that you put a plan in place from day one to say what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and do it then. Because, you know, very often, as a woodland officer for the Forestry Commission, you know, very often I'll be going back to farms at year 5 and year 10 to look at woodland planting, and, you know, you were almost looking at 100% losses at times, you know, it's such a waste of everybody's efforts, you know, and can't recommend. If you can get in there and do some maintenance for the first 3 years, 2-3 years, and keep those trees growing, once the heads are up and on above deer height as well, you've sort of cracked it. But if you don't do that very early maintenance, then we've all just wasted an hour. So.
And it's really self-interest, because we want our trees to be producing shelter within 3 or 4 years. And I've got trees 4 years old over 5 meters, 5, 6, 7 meters high now, and they are really going away. And it's purely because we put the matting on, we looked after them. But even with that, we in the beating up process, we tried weed every year. We use the very smallest hole possible through the matting so that the nettles and thistles don't come up through the bidoo. And
That was an important point about the beating up process, because that was one of the things with funding that we were looking at, wasn't it? Because it wasn't included in the funding initially, but that is changing, because for me that was really critical, that second year beating up, and unless you plan that and you've got that costed in for time and management, you're sort of onto a losing start. So it's a really important part of the management is to factor that in.
Question.
So I've got two questions. One is, what sort of soil prep have you found is best for planting Shelterbelts? And the second one is, what are you doing in terms of maintenance, say after year 5? Are you treating them as hedgerows? Are you crown lifting them, or as you say pruning to create that gap?
Yeah, so I'll take the second one first. I mean, to maintain that porosity, and I think we've not been doing that. You know, generally on farms, people haven't been doing that. We've been planting a Shelterbelt or just leaving it. I think John mentioned, you know, sort of we can take sort of photography and look at the porosity. Pruning is certainly something that would help that porosity. Sort of, if you just allow that little bit of wind to go through the crop, it helps. And it's just a visual check, really. So check it in the summertime. Winter time, if you've got some Scots pine and other sort of evergreens in the Shelterbelt, it'll help that porosity in the winter time when the leaves are off. So it's more of a visual check. But I think by pruning, and you've got that high tree element, and then you've got the shrub element and the sort of mid layer below it, you can actually manage those. And you mentioned blackthorn coming in. I mean, that can be quite painful, literally, to manage, really, can't you? Because it is pretty prevalent in a lot of places. So it does take management. And your first question about what soil preparation you can do, I would say it depends where you are, and tree planting in any soil medium is important to consider. And it might be, we heard earlier this morning about drilling, using an auger. It depends on the numbers of trees and the scale of the project you've got. Forestry planting just using a spade might not be the right thing. It certainly might not be the best thing. And if you're planting just a couple of Shelterbelts, maybe you can go that extra mile and you can use an auger and perhaps add some elements into that hole that will help establishment. As I said before, the quicker you can establish those trees, the better.
We always mow across before we put the mapping down. We put that afterwards. We will answering yes, absolutely. As far as maintenance is concerned, Jim said pruning. How do you do it? But I think from creating porosity point of view, we might even just put a hedge cutter vertically down and make a whoop down just to let it air through. I think that would be easy to do. But we watch the space on that.
What do you recommend for this anger on the ribs and cutting that? The head they sell this zip hypervisor?
Yeah, if you were here in the earlier discussion, one of the farmers was doing exactly that. Auger hole, putting some mycorrhizal sort of pellets in, and then some mulch, and then backfilling with soil. Give the tree every chance to blame off.
It was just about the pruning, because I come from a kind of garden design background coming into this. But obviously when you prune something, you're then making it more bushy. So how are you pruning it? It's all very well having a hedge trimmer just like, whoa, but then the following year it's going to be 5 times density. So that's not going to be the long-term effect.
Absolutely right. 50% we have. I'm really looking forward to coming up with descriptions over the years for keeping that 50%. I think we need to be able to measure it first, and I think we need the drones and the microscopic. At the moment, there's no very good way of measurement. Leaf area index hasn't worked. Various other systems haven't worked. But I think we have got the answer to that, and following on from that, I hope we'll come up with.
Because it's a gentle,
sensible. Maybe even just cutting trees out, and reducing them.
I was going to say, I mean, using all the measures, so coppicing, pollarding, removing, pruning. Use all those sort of tricks in the book.
Sorry, one written question here.
The key thing is that with the shelter belt, you've got different heights, so you've got different things to manage. So it isn't ever going to be one thing, one pruning in one go. And that's the next stage, isn't it? That is developing a prescription for each particular one. So, for example, I've got 5 metre shelter belts. I had 2 metre hedgerows that we've added in to become a shelter belt, and so that management of that is completely different to the first shelter belt. Yeah.
Yes, a similar question to the last one about how you measure this 50% porosity. I mean, all the trees you mentioned are broadleaves, so presumably in winter they have far greater porosity at a time when you need more, and in summer you've got massive porosity when you need it less. Would you ever use conifers in a mix as a sort of occasional trees?
Yes, we do use Scots pine at the moment, and we certainly were against that. I think we're talking really about the interaction of what I call crop degree days, of when you need the maximum growth. And obviously in the winter, for crops it won't matter, for livestock more important. Maybe you'll get easier porosity in the winter by just not having the leaves there. But that really is a rather limited area. Then the important thing is on your maximum growing time, which you have your maximum crop degree days.
This isn't a question, so don't worry, panel. I just want to go back to the mycorrhiza point, just to make a plug for a session that's on in this tent tomorrow at 3 o'clock, where we've got 2 of the companies that are selling these fungal pellets and incorporating them into the tree planting on farms, not just for effective tree establishment. Everything Jim said about that sort of importance of the first 2 to 3 years is critical, but also in terms of that whole woodland ecology and bringing that onto the farmland as well. So come and listen to Regenus and Rhizocor talk about that tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're getting close to people wanting their lunch. We're nearly at 1 o'clock, so any more points you want to make, John, or any last questions?
No, I'd just like to thank Becky and you very much. Sorry, one more question.
One more question.
Important.
Sorry, I'll make it quick. Just wondering about I acknowledge all of the microclimate benefits trees offer, but they do inevitably demand water, and water is going to become increasingly scarce. In terms of climate resilience, where do you prioritise water demand when you're choosing what species to put into shelter belts?
But I think the main feature of microclimate will be in improved humidity. Or I think you will get more around there. We've planted quite a lot of shelter belts where water is resilience, and valley catchment and other areas. I can't really think what I can say that will be made, but I don't think it's a bad thing. What we're doing anyway, how much we're benefiting that. I think our trees generally are accepted as producing more humidity. I think and better things.
Time goes.
I was going to say, you've got to remember the shading effect of those trees as well, Mohammed. So does at the top just a straight line, this is bad, this is good. It's one effect has multiple. One feature like a tree, whilst it's drawing on water, it's also shading the earth and cooling the earth. So it's not as black and white as it might seem. But I agree, there are parts of the country where water considerations are really important before you plant trees. I don't want to live in one of them, so I'm okay.
So sorry, we've lost power, which is why I don't think it's
That's fine.
But yeah, so well, thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Yes.